Welcome, engineers. My name is Travis IQ, and today we're going to talk about authentication. Authentication, specifically passwords. So authentication is how we identify ourselves, right? How I identify you as you. One of those mechanisms would be passwords, username, password instances. We can talk about some other mechanisms, and we might towards the end of this section here, but let's think about passwords. And the reason that we're thinking about passwords right now is because I have seen a lot of posts on some security organizations' Twitter feeds, and another security professional that I'm a big fan of, Todd Lamley, who's a friend of ours, a friend of Intelligence Quest, as you saw my little logo up there. Anyway, I've seen this a few different places, and I thought it would be something really great to talk about, right? Is password security. And so we talk about password security and password rules and requirements, right? And so what that means is when you usually think of password rules and requirements, usually what it means is to you is my required length. So how many characters do I have to use? What characters can I use? What characters am I required to use? But where does this come from? And we'll talk about some of the password standards and where the standards come from, but why are they made, right? Numerically. The reason that they're made is a chart like this, right? So based on the number of characters and the type of characters allowed, right? So upper and lower case and special characters and symbols and things like this, we can predict, right, with a very high degree of certainty how easy it is for your password to get cracked with modern algorithms. Or modern utilities, things like Cain Enable, for example, is a password cracking utility, right? Loft crack and oft crack, these things. And so if our number of characters is relatively low, let's say 4 characters with just numbers, an algorithm could crack this password instantly. Again, with numbers only, we have to get to a very high character threshold to even require some time to do this. If I start adding in complexity with lowercase letters and numbers, lowercase and uppercase letters, numbers, upper and lowercase letters in combination, and then finally, right, probably the most complex of them all, which is numbers, upper and lowercase, right? You can see that with only a few characters, right, 6 or so, we can get up to taking 5 seconds or so to crack that password. 5 seconds, not particularly long, right, Travis? I agree with you. How about now we start using longer passwords with higher degrees of complexity? Now it's going to take, let's say with 12 characters and upper, lowercase, letters and symbols, it's going to take us 34,000 years. Or 13 characters, it's going to take us 2 million years to crack that password, right? Why is this? The reason is the number of combinations that I can make, the number of password combinations that I can make with that many characters increases exponentially. Every time I add a number of characters, right, or every time I add a set of symbols that I can use, that exponentially increases the difficulty. And you can see that exponential here, right? We go from 5 seconds to 6 minutes, that's an order of magnitude. 6 minutes to 8 hours, another order of magnitude. 8 hours to weeks, order of magnitude. Years, order of magnitude. Hundreds of years, thousands of years, millions of years, hundreds of millions, 15 billion, right? And so what we need are password policies that get us to this green range here, where it's going to take you a very long time to crack that password. What does that mean? It means it's going to take a long time, right? But it also means that it's not going to be worth your while from a computational standpoint, right? It means that if I could throw all of the computation in the world at this, which would cost me a lot of money, basically, it's going to take me a very long time to crack this password. And so it's all about dollars, right? Dollars in and dollars out most of the time for malicious users, right? So if I can crack a password for $5,000, but I think that the information that password is protecting is going to be worth more than $5,000, $50,000, then it makes sense financially for me to attempt to crack that password. And you say, well, how do I equate cracking time or computational power to dollars? It's actually very easy, right? If you think about virtualized environments, AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, right? You can just literally pay for compute cycles. So you can actually make that calculation very easily if you wanted to go down that route. Okay. So we've established that longer passwords, right, are better and more complexity. More interestingly enough, though, I don't have to require you, and we're going to see this in the NIST standards coming up. You can kind of see it up here on the top. We're going to see this in a second, but I don't need to require you to use all of this stuff, right? All I have to do is give you the opportunity. Why is that? My background is actually in computer modeling, and what we would call this in computer modeling is increasing the search space. So what happens with just four characters and only numbers, what that means is the space that I have to search, 1111, 1112, 1113, if I were to brute force that password, check every combination in the space, is relatively small. If I increase the number of characters with just numbers, it still gets larger, but it's still relatively small in terms of the algorithms that are needed to crack those passwords. But I can still brute force that. Once I start using a lot of characters and a wide variety of symbols, cases, and special characters, now the search space gets really, really large, exponentially large. And an algorithm to search an entire space like that, right, or to brute force the entire space, which is to try and solve every single or look at every single possible combination in that space, becomes practically not doable. And so really all I have to do is give you the opportunity to do this. And then I'm requiring the people cracking the password, the malicious hosts cracking these passwords, to search this large space in here. A quick side note, whenever I teach these classes live, I get a good question about why or how I think quantum computing is going to affect this, because quantum computing is going to exponentially increase the number of computations that we can do in a given period of time. And I agree with you, right? And my answer is a couple of things. One, dependent upon the value of the target, right? Quantum computing is going to be so hard or so expensive computationally, right, still, that it's going to be impractical to try and crack all these passwords with quantum computers. And you would say, well, Travis, at some point it's going to become, as ubiquitous as traditional computing and silicon-based computing, right? And I agree with you in that case as well. And hopefully, right, as is always the case, both malicious hosts and blue team, the good guys, will have access to these utilities. And so what we should be able to do, right, moving forward is using algorithms that take advantage of quantum computing characteristics as well, right, to kind of give us this same outlook here, where I have lower complexity is going to be easier to crack and higher complexity is going to be harder to crack. It's just going to be the complexity ranges are going to be a little bit different in terms of quantum computing. Okay, just a side note if you were interested in that. So how do we roll out policies, password policies, to make sure that our users are in a range, in this green range here, right? And so what I'd like to do is point you to NIST. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology here in the United States, does publish guidelines for this. And I wanted to talk a little bit about something interesting, which is how these password policies have evolved over time. And so what NIST used to publish, and what we all, if you're in the corporate world, even if you're in sales or engineering or HR or something like this, if you had to sign onto your computer, that back in the earlier 2010s, the NIST standard and the way that these were traditionally implemented in the enterprise was actually very different than it is now, right? People were advised to use irregular capitalization, special characters, at least one number, and it was recommended that changing the password regularly every 90 days or so. Right, this is the advice that most of your system administrators use. It was baked into a lot of different software interfaces. Okay, if we think about this, and you may know this if you've been in the enterprise, if you haven't, I'll point this out to you, that if you had to use a ton of special characters, no common words, and you had to change that password every 3 months, and oftentimes there were password reuse policies, so you couldn't go back and reuse previous passwords that you have used, so there's no way to remember. And they would also have a minimum password time requirement, so you'd have to hold on to your passwords for a couple of days so that you couldn't just keep changing your passwords. So what happens here? I've already described to you how difficult it would be to memorize these passwords on a regular basis, right? And in fact, it was and still is, given these requirements from the 2013 NIST guidelines. And people would write their passwords down. They would stick them to their monitors. They would stick them underneath their keyboard, stick them to the ceiling with little Post-it notes. And when you came by and did an audit, you would see these people had posted their passwords in different places. That would make them vulnerable to a very, very simple hacking methodology, which is shoulder surfing. Look at your computer or look around your device and find a password and then input it and have access to your device. Now, limiting physical access is another thing altogether, but things to think about, right? So where have we gone then, right? What did NIST then say? Well, we agreed that we need to back off of these password change requirements, right? So in 2017, they did a major update, and they're still kind of revising these rules as well, right? But password lengths must still be 8 characters. The system should permit subscriber-chosen passwords up to 64. So that means we're increasing the search space, right? It should allow you to get up to 64 characters if you so choose, which means that if you're a brute forcer, you have to search that entire space. We should allow ASCII characters and Unicode characters should all be acceptable in passwords, again, increasing the search space. And we should check for weak or insecure passwords, common passwords, numerically incrementing passwords 1, 2, 3, 4, easily guessed English words, these types of things, right? And then we should also do things like password salting, which we'll talk about at another time, and key derivation functions, right? One way password storage utilities, PBKDF2 is something that comes to mind here if you've seen this. Password-based key derivation function. Get it? Key derivation function. Yeah. Okay. So now that we have recommendations from NIST and we understand why they're there and we understand how passwords work, right? Then there should be one other thing that I wanted to talk about before we end this authentication section. This is why I called it authentication when I started and not just passwords. And that is, you would say, Travis, multifactor, right? MFA. And we could go into some more depth into this at another time, but multi-factor authentication, or 2FA, two-factor authentication, right? And if you look in here, it should be in these notes somewhere, but it says do not use SMS, right? So text message multi-factor auth is no good. If you remember, and I'll leave a link to this in the show notes, but the Twitter CEO, Jack Dorsey, was hacked at one point in the last couple of years. And that was a result of using SMS as his second factor of authentication. And what they did is a very common methodology to bypass SMS, which is SIM swapping. And so they ported his SIM to another phone. And then when his second factor was requested and a text was sent to his phone, it was sent to the phone of the hackers, and they used that as a second factor to then authenticate as him and tweet on his behalf. You will notice then very quickly that Twitter allowed multi-factor auth other than SMS, which they hadn't previously done. Right? They said, yeah, maybe it's not that good considering the CEO got hacked, and went back and amended their policies and procedures to allow for multi-factor auth. Right, and so I'll give you a good example of a utility that facilitates multi-factor authentication. There's a number, and we will talk about multi-factor auth another time, but one of my favorites is the YubiKey. This little guy right here. A little one-time pass generator that acts as a keyboard, and so it's got a one-time pass algorithm built into the little USB and little keyboard. It functions as a little keyboard and places a one-time pass in there for you that gets authenticated against the one-time pass generated somewhere else. Yeah. So multi-factor auth via YubiKeys. Google used YubiKeys at one point in their corporate environments and things like this. I use a YubiKey, just so you know, for other things. But this is another mechanism of authentication. And we'll talk about other mechanisms for authentication as well in kind of our multi-factor auth section. But that's why we started with authentication, talked a lot about passwords, and then went to MFA. That being said, another interesting cybersecurity discussion about passwords and some authentication and NIST standards. As is always the case, though, engineer, break stuff, and have fun.